Good evening and welcome to Be Informed. My name is Carl Buhariwala, and today we're looking at the topic of change management. Before I proceed, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Today's session is on change management, and we'll be looking at the topic of navigating change in business. And we're joined by Phil Didamo of the Change Lounge, who will be taking us through some important information about how change should be effectively managed in business operations. And I think now it's more important than ever that we do consider this topic, because with global uncertainty, economic changes, and various other conditions that are impacting businesses around the globe, change is definitely a topic of concern that needs to be managed so that the business can continue to sustain itself and grow in the direction that it wishes to take. So before we proceed with the seminar that Phil will present, just a few housekeeping matters. Today's session is being recorded, so if you do have to drop off early, you can always watch the entire session on our YouTube channel a bit later today and moving forward. All the information presented in today's session is general information only. So if you do have any specific queries about any personal circumstances, your business circumstances, please do engage a professional like Phil. The information presented in today's seminar is current as of today. And if you do wish to rely on the session materials in the future, you may wish to reconsider its applicability. But given the sort of transient nature of change, I guess it'll still be relevant in the future. So just bear that in mind. And the presenter, Phil, has kindly prepared a one-page handout, which I will share with registered participants by email. So at least you have a handy copy of Phil's notes for future reference. That will also contain Phil's details as well. So if you have any questions specifically about the subject matter, please do not hesitate to contact Phil directly. So with all that in mind, I'll now hand over to Phil, who will take us through the seminar, and after that we'll then proceed into Q&A. If you do have any questions, feel free to raise them in the chat function to me, and I will relay them to Phil for him to respond. All right, Phil, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. And I see 4 boxes or 4 people. Can you just confirm how many we've got there, Carl?
Yeah, Phil, we've got a few others as well, but some remain undisclosed as well. So
Okay.
Yeah, great.
All right, thank you, and welcome everyone, and thank you so much for your time. I realise this is it's a bit of an awkward time. It's a difficult time because it's dinner time, so I'll try to make this as interactive as possible. Carl, I'll just thank you for this opportunity to be part of what you do. You run a great social enterprise in Be Informed. I think your aim to help people make good decisions is really admirable. So thanks for that opportunity to talk about it and for me to talk about this topic of navigating change. I'm going to be talking about change, but my main purpose today is really to provoke a discussion on how we continue to pursue growth and opportunity, whether it be in business, work, or in life, in a world that feels pretty uncertain and feels quite unstable at the moment and unpredictable. So that's the main thrust of my message. My core message today will be that we need to shift the way we think and work if we want to remain in control, if we want to continue to be successful and be prosperous in whatever it is that we do. And my intention is to leave you with some practical tips on what you can actually do. So that's the aim. That's what I'm going to do. If we can move to the next slide, please, Carl. So look, this is kind of stating the obvious, but basically change and disruption is everywhere. It's every time we wake up, every time we listen to the news, every time we catch up on events, we recognize that we're being bombarded by different events. Some we could see coming, a lot of it we couldn't see coming. We might not like it all, and not all change is bad, because it's disruptive, but we can't ignore it either. And that's the thing about change. If we do ignore it, we really run that risk of being left behind. So in my time, in my career, in my work, I've come across so many people, and I can really see that they are struggling with the concept of change. They can identify it, but they really struggle to process it. They really struggle to say, I don't really know what to do with it. I haven't encountered this before. I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to be doing. And it's causing me a great deal of stress. So this has kind of been a passion of mine, an area of research of mine for probably a good 30 years. By change, what I'm talking about, and this is where it really is different, we've moved from this idea of episodic disruption to permanent volatility. There was a time where we could say, okay, well, that's interesting, that's changed. We've got time to process that. We kind of know what that is, we can work it out. But now that kind of disruption has become quite permanent. And I refer to it, and I have referred it to this notion of VUCA. VUCA is an acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And essentially what it means is that our world has become a series of rapid, unpredictable changes in technologies, in life events, in markets. The future outcomes become really unclear. We're not quite sure where it's all going. Our past experience doesn't actually help us to determine what we should be doing. And it's really complex because it's not one change, it's multiple changes, and they all connect in a different way. And it's very ambiguous because people have different interpretations. If you think of the Iran war as an example, people will have their own interpretations. You can ask people, what's it about? When's it likely to end? People don't know. And so we're faced with this kind of information every day. And so life feels a lot like a blur in many respects. And it feels like we're jumping from one crisis to another. That's what life's become. Now, humans themselves are really amazing at solving problems, but with VUCA, we're kind of out of our depth a little bit. And all of this is challenging how we live, how we lead. We're not used to this. We're kind of used to what this thing might be described as industrial age living. We're used to being able to plan things and execute them. We're used to stabilizing things and looking to stabilize things. We're used to setting long-term commitments. Our role has often been identified by our careers and what we do, and our security has been around structure and control. All of that seems to be shifting. We're no longer seeing that. Life's become less one of planning. It's become more one of trying to make sense of things. It's less about stability, but it's more about adaptability and so forth. So, and even our own careers, we're needing to think much more like business enterprises than individuals in a particular career. So change is becoming really, really difficult to navigate. And we're shifting from this idea of a world that was forecastable and predictable to one that is less so. It's just continually emergent. And we're sitting here trying to work out to what happens next. The last point on this one is to say there's a breakdown of 20th century leadership, business and career models. Now, I'm probably like many around here, I've got hundreds and hundreds of books on leadership and management and so forth. And Rick here, who's my partner, can vouch for that. But I have to say that anything that's more than 10 years old is completely out of date. If I read them and I look at them, I'm thinking that won't work today. So we're facing this issue that our knowledge, our experience, all of that, particularly 20th century stuff, is completely out of date and is no longer applicable. And we're seeing that, I think, in fact, if you just look at the way the wars are being fought, they're completely different. If you think of how drones are being used. So everything that might have been considered as military strategy is now changing completely. It's completely unpredictable. It's new. And in many cases, we don't know what to do about it. Thanks, Carl. So I just want to spend a little bit of time speaking about the human side of change. And in life is better for us on so many fronts. If you look at medicine, if you look at technology, if you look at access to information, if you look at our ability to connect, we have so many good things. We've got more freedom, we've got more opportunity, we've got more connection. We live longer. We even have higher expectations of what we want life and business to be. But against that, we've got more responsibility. We have less dependency on others. We've got more ambiguity. There's opportunity, but those opportunities start to overwhelm us. We've got more connection, but we've got more fragmentation. People are feeling even more disconnected than what they were before. We live longer, but there's a need for us to constantly reinvent ourselves. So for all the positives of change, there's an opposite side, which is that we find it quite draining. We find it quite confusing, and we find it so complex that we're almost paralyzed in this weight and wave of change. And in some cases, it's energizing. Some people love this space. Some would say, I feel really energized by it. And for others, it feels completely destabilizing. What does it mean? It means for us to be successful, though, we need to rethink what we do. We need to rethink what it means to live our lives, run our businesses. We must have the capacity and the confidence to adapt. And we've got to be prepared for plans that change. So our lives are becoming a lot more fluid, and we need to, so in other words, the best response for a chaotic world is to live a fluid world, a nimble world, and that's where it's heading. And so I talk about it as we need to live much like a surfer who doesn't ride every wave that comes their way, but knows what waves to pick, or an artist who's understands rejection, understands that you constantly need to innovate, understands collaboration, understands networking. Builders, who know, for example, that you start with a base and then you continue to build because there's no great formula, or philosophers who think deeply, and we need to draw on that wisdom about understanding and making sense out of life. So we're seeing this shift, and it's a shift from building a stable life or business to building a flexible one. That is the paradigm shift. That's what we're starting to see, and that's where we need to move towards. Thanks, Carl. I wanted to have this slide about talking about change, and because it matters and it's important. Now, for many people, change can be a bit of a taboo subject. We kind of know it's there, but we'd rather not talk about it. And there's several reasons behind it. One of them is we're not actually wired for this. We're actually wired for stability and predictability. We're not wired for this world where we're being bombarded from one crisis and one issue to the next. So that's the thing. We're more left brain wired than right brain wired. Left brain is very much about rational thinking and problem solving, evidence-based decisions. It's very much around that. Right brain is that creative side of our brain, that brain that thinks in terms of change, that thinks in terms of flexibility. We're rewarded for consistency still. And if you think about our education system and our jobs and our banking and our mortgages, consistency is what is really valuable. People like to see the same thing. It's predictable. They know what they're dealing with. And what VUCA does, though, is it triggers a threat for us. It triggers disruption, discomfort. It's completely opposite to that. And uncertainty activates flight or fight instincts, and then our emotional reactions can override that rational thinking. So our natural instinct when facing this level of change is silence. But silence increases risks, and then we miss signals, and then innovation dies quietly. So that's a bit of a dilemma. On the one hand, I think we are much more used and comfortable with the idea of predictability, problem solving, evidence-based, and using the left side of our brain. On the other hand, the world is moving so fast, so chaotically, that thinking needs to shift, and therefore we need to think much more, less as a military strategist and more as an artist if we're going to survive. So modern leadership, if we ask, how do we lead our businesses, how do we lead our organizations, is very much about this idea of adapt, less about control. If you try to control and keep doing what you're currently doing and keeping that in check, then you're going to miss the boat. So leadership now is very much about what I describe as adaptable leadership. So the advantage now really belongs to those who they're open, they're grounded, they're engaging, they allow safe conversation, and they're strategically aware. That's kind of what it's starting to look like. Thanks, Carl. So I think what this calls for, and my call to action is, we've got to get better at this. We need to move with the times. We need to understand what we're facing and what we're dealing with. And we've got to get better at not just navigating change, but managing it at the same time. If you're in business and you're in charge, then it's about your directive leadership becomes less effective. The more complexity you have, the kind of less control you've got. The more complexity you've got, the more your success will come from enabling others to respond and adapt. If you try to do it on your own and try to hang on to it as an expert, you're going to struggle. You really need to be able to delegate, involve, and empower people to ride this wave with you. You've got to design businesses and organizations that benefit from volatility, and that is, don't try to perfect it. You've got to run pilots, test prototypes, learn fast, fail small. And then ambiguity demands experimentation. That's kind of what we're doing. And that means iteration beats overthinking things. And experimentation works only if people feel safe to try and fail. And I've worked in organisation. This kind of idea of psychological safety is easier said than done. There's a lot of people who like to have their ideas, but they're fearful. And in a world that's changing and where even jobs are at risk through AI, I think people are starting to clam up. At a time when we need people to be innovative and creative and to put everything on the table, you're up against the risk of, if I do that and if I speak up and do it, then how do I retain my job? And that's where that fear factor comes in. And so the other part of it is this constant change exhausts people. And some people will just say, many of you would have heard the term change fatigue. I'm fatigued. We've changed so many times. I don't know where to go to next. I'm absolutely exhausted. So if you're running a business or leading others, your job now is how do you manage energy? Because adaptation requires energy, not just following a strategy. Thanks, Carl. So that might sound negative, but on the other side of this, VUCA in this world that we've got creates tremendous opportunity. And the beauty of disruption means it almost acts like that burning platform. If you can't ignore it, it kind of kicks you into this new mode. It forces evolution because you have no choice. You have to evolve. If you don't, you start to realize if we don't, we're going to fall behind. And we know we're falling behind because all our benchmarks and all our indicators are showing it. So, and then adaptability and innovation gets rewarded under VUCA. Those who can get rewarded. Those who are the front runners, the leaders in relation to these things, those who adapt early and soon, ahead of their competitors, are going to have that advantage, and that's going to be rewarded. The other thing about VUCA is new needs and markets emerge all the time. So if you think that's my business and these are my customers, and you think that's all there is, the reality is, as new problems emerge, so do new customers, new needs, new customers, and that's a really positive thing. When you release control, opportunities start to emerge. And so what volatility does is it disrupts those old patterns, and that's what you need to get unstuck. It creates space for fresh ideas and new thinking. And for individuals, it gives them an opportunity to say, you know what, I'm just not going to sit here and let this beat me. I'm going to take charge of this. I'm going to own it. I'm going to take control of my learning, my mindset, and I'm going to develop skills. So there's an opportunity under VUCA for people to say, I'm just not going to sit here. I need to evolve with it. And with that, I need to continue to learn. I need to continue to reinvent myself. This diagram on the right over here, I could spend probably hours on. But to me, it represents fluidity and understanding how VUCA and how our mindset needs to shift. And what it shows is that we go from this space of contentment being we like what we're doing. It feels good. There's nothing to fix here. We're satisfied. We're feeling pretty calm. And then VUCA comes along and we don't know what to do. And the first reaction we've got is to move to this room of denial. And that is we kind of hang on to the past. If we stick around long enough, if we try to hang on to it, we'll get back to where it was. And then resistance kicks in. We become fearful of that change and we become quite unaware of what's going on. And we can stay that. Some businesses or some people just stay in this room of denial. And the way they do that is they censor. They pretend it's not there. They train their mind to think, I'm just going to ignore it. I'll just switch off the news. I'm not going to read these things because my hope is we go back. Until something comes up and all of a sudden you start to realize, I can't ignore the fact that that contentment that I've got is gone. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to get back there. Because I'm not sure, I go into this state of confusion. But being in confusion, I've kind of accepted that I can't go back to what I've got. I'm therefore ready to explore, to learn. I'm not even sure about where it's going to go, but I'm willing to sort through that and spend some time in that. And once you start doing that, you reach this point, you come out of it and you say, actually, there is those opportunities. I can see now that the world's moved on. And then you move into this room of renewal, which is very much about inspiration, new paths, taking action and being open. And then you get back to another contentment. So for me, I think, and my message that I'm wanting to share is that this type of thinking, this kind of mindset where we go through these stages quite frequently of contentment, denial, confusion, and renewal is in fact becoming the norm. And we need to get this. We need to adopt that kind of mindset. I just wanted to finish off with, okay, practically what could we do? We know it's there. We know the world is chaotic. We know it's confusing. We know it's complex. So I'm wanting to leave you with 7 tips to navigate this VUCA world in business. The first one is stop treating strategy or planning as a year event. Stop thinking of it as, I'll just do a plan for the year at the beginning of the year. These are my New Year's resolution. That's not going to hold. You won't last. There'll be more change than that. You need to think very much about running continuous strategy loops. If you're leading a team, get them together on a Monday or a time in the week where you start asking them, okay, what are you picking up? What are you seeing? Where are we relevant? Where are we becoming redundant? Engage your staff in that particular process and do it frequently. The second tip that I'd give you is build skills over job titles. Job titles don't mean much, but if you're running a business or you're thinking about yourself personally, think in terms of what skills do I need to do? If you're not building skills, and Rita and I were talking about this earlier today, there is so much opportunity to learn and pick up new skills and training courses, and it's free. So if you're not doing that several times a week, you're probably falling behind the pace of what it takes to continue to learn new skills. The third tip is mix internal with external talent. If you're a business, think about working with freelancers, partners, AI agents, and communities. Don't try to, collate and build all the intellect about your business internally. Be open to external input from the likes of experts by doing what you're doing tonight, coming along to these sorts of things. Fourthly, mix human and machine work. Use AI as a collaborator. I know people are getting used to it. I know there's some negative publicity, but there is so much advantage and speed in using AI. It doesn't, I think, replace intuitive thinking. It doesn't replace judgment, but it's a great starter. And I think we need to come to grips with the fact that it's here, it's there to stay. The most fundamental question is, what should humans uniquely do? What is your role as a human being? How do you become almost more human? The fifth tip is to shift leadership to whoever has the insight, energy, or proximity to the problem. If you're running a business and you've got a team, if they're closer to the problem, give them the leadership. Ask them to come up with it. You don't need to solve every problem. Empower your people. If they're closer to it, they're more likely to know what to do about it. So shift the leadership. The sixth tip is mix stability with change. The businesses that will feel most stable are the ones that are constantly evolving. I'm not saying throw out, the baby with the bathwater. I'm not saying you've just got to, create upheaval. But how do you get that balance right? I need to be stable in this area, but at the same time, I need to be leading change at the same time. What percentage are you spending on both? So that tip is about mixing stability with change. And the last tip I would say is blur your personal and your professional development. You have to evolve personally. You need to spend time on yourself. You need to understand what skills you need to develop, what your gaps are. But you've got to do that. And if you're leading a team, you've got to lead yourself at the same time. Your leadership will stall professionally if you're not working on yourself. And stretch yourself too. That's the other part of it. Don't get used to this world of stability in a world that's no longer stable. Really think in terms of how can I slightly stretch what I do? How can I continuously learn? What's missing? What's next for me? So you need to constantly be thinking about how you reinvent yourself and renew yourself overall. So careers, if you're in a job, careers are now a series of reinventions, not a linear climb. So if you are in a career and you have your job, what is your reinvention? Where are you going? What is likely to be not just your plan A, but your plan B or your plan C? So I'm going to leave it there, Carl, and thanks everyone for listening. And now I'm open to comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. That was great. And your summary of the 7 tips, I think, are quite important to resonate with. So hopefully that, really does strike a chord with our listeners today. I'll just share Phil's details on the screen. So Phil of the Change Lounge, thanking him for his time to present this seminar. For those that have joined late, this session is being recorded, so you can watch the entire session on our YouTube channel later today and in the future. And Phil has also prepared a one-page handout, which I'll share with registered participants by email. You can have that handy document for your benefit or to share with others as you wish. So with that in mind, we'll now go into the Q&A part of today's session. And Phil, you've talked about a few sort of examples of how to sort of bring, your employees and your workforce along that journey of change. Do you think it's a cultural piece as well, that you need to actually invigorate your staff to think that changes can actually be good, rather than being a hard task to complete or follow? How do you sort of help, if you're a business owner or a team leader, how do you sort of help your staff to embrace that change and ensure that they sort of align with the cultural movement of the business?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. Look, I think culture will play a big part in this. Culture being the way we do things around here is kind of what that is what culture is. If your culture is about control and stability, and waiting for those events to catch up to you, if the message that you send in your culture and your leadership is not a culture of change, is not a culture of innovation, is not a culture of renewal, then nobody will engage with it. So what you do as a leader or as a business owner to encourage people to do, so what you say becomes really important. What you ask of your team becomes really important. How safe you create the workplace for ideas becomes really critically important. Now, we've got a problem in Australia. We've got a real productivity problem. If you have a look at the data around productivity, it's really low. It's really poor. Um, and so there's a lot of organizations encountering this, um, and some of them investing in technology, but a lot of them, I would say, don't quite know how to lead for productivity. They don't quite know how to lead for innovation. And some leaders feel quite vulnerable and exposed when you're asking your team to come up with ideas. They kind of feel, but isn't that my job? Isn't that what I'm supposed to be doing? So the first thing you need to ask yourself is, what is our culture now? Is that conducive to this world that we're living in? What does our culture need to be? And if you're leading that group, you've got to ask yourself, what do I need to do? What is my own personal culture change that I will have to make that signals that I'm open to very, very different ways of doing that? How do I make myself a leader that is a controlling leader that's very good at what I've done over the last 10, 20, 30 years, to a leader who's open and fluid? That's huge. Psychologically, it's massive. But that's where we've got to get to.
Right. And Phil, just a question on change itself. So we've spoken a lot about how to respond to change and what sort of mindset, and we talked about the culture just before, that you need to have and the approaches that you take. What sort of steps, Phil, would you recommend taking to actually assess whether the change is beneficial or not? I would assume that not all change is for the better. So what sort of steps should be taken before you then respond to that change?
Yeah, and I think this is where it's a great question, Carl, because if you'd asked me about a month ago, I would say it's well documented. You actually follow these steps. You create that burning platform. You set a vision. You create these first steps. You build a coalition of supporters. You communicate. If you look at the history of change management, they would say, if you follow this formula, it's going to be successful. Now, that works for episodic change, for one-off change. It doesn't work for the kind of change that we're describing. So for me, it's less a step-by-step exercise. It goes back to your first question, which is, how do you create cultures whereby you're thinking of change all the time? How do you create those pilots? Going back to one of my earlier slides, which is pilots and testing and experimentation. How do you accept a degree of failure? So for me, I think it's less of a step-by-step exercise. I think it's much more of a mindset and a way you do it, and a culture that has in place. Not every change is going to be successful, but what organizations do is they can spend 12 months rolling out a change program, and 70% of that time it fails. And the reason it fails is because the reasons why you started, the reasons for commencing that change, relevant at that time, are no longer relevant because the market's moved on. And that's the risk and failure of what I call structured step-by-step change.
Yeah, I think yes. Now now more important than ever that we sort of think about that change can be very volatile, and how it actually applies in a business setting or in your personal circumstances. Um, there's a degree of uncertainty, and I think that's going to require individuals that need to sort of, I guess, enhance their skills to adapt and be a bit more resilient, to think about sort of how they go about flexing that muscle. Um, and I think recent events just show that change can happen in any form. And I think those that are more aware of it and conscious about it and receptive will probably outperform others. So, Phil, we've just got a question around, we talk about how change is important, and why people need to understand that it's a part of a going concern. It should be as part of business as usual for a lot of people, right? And we spoke at the start about culture and how you have to bring along, the coalition of supporters within the organisation, I guess. Not everyone will be in your coalition of supporters. Some, might not be. But how do you sort of balance it out if you're a team leader? How do you sort of balance out the different sort of mindsets of your team so that you don't start creating, I guess, separation between those that are very much, embracing the change, those that are not, and then those that are not sort of tend to be shunned away or seen as not being, supporters. How, as a team leader, do you balance that dynamic? I guess it's sort of linked to that first question around culture, because I think in many organizations you do face that dynamic that needs to be effectively managed if you're a team leader.
So that's a great question. What the research shows is that people are divided into kind of two groups, and the extremes are one set is completely open to change. They live for inspiration. They live for new ideas. They get excited by moving on from something. They see things all the time and want to move towards it. They just want to jump to it. They're absolutely crazy change agents, right? They are so crazy that they can't land a lot of their ideas of change. They spend a lot of time confused because they never seem to land anything. So they are what I call passionate change makers, right? Very, very good at what they do. The other group are those that would say, I need some evidence and I need some proof that this change is worthwhile, because I don't want to waste my effort on something that I feel is working pretty good. And they're the kind that get really annoyed with leadership and they say, this feels like change for change's sake, right? And so, so you're going to have two groups of people, and some are going to jump on board immediately and want to be part of it and want to engage in it. And others will come along to your workshops and discussions and think, for God's sake, do we really need to be going through this again? Can't we just get on with the job that we've got? And that's what you're facing around that. Now, that's difficult for a leader because you're going to have to work with both those groups. One will basically go off, and you're going to have to bring them in and say, I love the idea that you're excited by change, right? But hold your horses a bit. I've got to take some of those ideas and we've got to start prioritizing and thinking what's worthwhile and what's not. And with the others, it's about facing a reality. You need to show them. If they're not convinced about change, you're going to spend some time on that. And that is about facing the reality. What is going on? If you're a leader in those people, don't try to give them a solution, but try to explain the reality and try to explain why you think change is not working. Because unless they can see it and unless they take ownership, they're going to be difficult to budge, right? They're going to say, I'm content and I'm just going to fight my way through this and hope it goes away. And I know it goes away because I've seen so many change attempts before end up failing, and then we go back to where we were. So if you've experienced this stuff, you realize that because change hasn't always succeeded, there are some people who will just resist it and say, I'm not buying into it. So if you're a leader, you need to manage both. On one hand, try to contain a little bit the excitement and say, I need you. On the other hand, help others face a reality and then bring these people along. It's not that one is a better person than the other. They both have very valid arguments and perspectives on whether change is there. That's why I think change is not one that you hit an announcement and put out a communication, or you get the CEO to go out and to say, this is what we're doing. How exciting is that? Everybody on board? Great. And think it's going to work. It doesn't work that way. It takes some time to get there. But it helps. It helps if you've got a culture of change. If you build a culture of change, then people will make sense of what you're trying to describe and what you're trying to do.
That's perfect. And Phil, you mentioned, one of these slides around, constant change can be exhausting. And I think that's quite pertinent because many organizations are going through change. You talk about organizational changes with a lot of, companies sort of cutting, staff numbers, operationally thinking about, where they should be spending money and not spending money. sort of, whether they take on new product lines or start ceasing, sort of certain product lines that are probably not performing well or achieving certain milestones. With all these sort of activities happening, of course, which is now being compounded by global events as well, that can be quite exhausting on the workforce. And I think a lot of sort of organizations think about, cultivating and, sort of inspiring a high performing culture, a high performing workforce, right? How do you sort of sustain all this change, um, and ensure that the workforce is still sort of buying into it and do not feel exhausted to the extent that they then lose hope, or you see good talent leave the business? How do you sort of, as a business owner, feel, what sort of recommendations would you have, or if they're a team leader, to sort of ensure that all these activities are happening, which is great, but you're not doing that to the you know to the causing exhaustion in your workforce, which then leads to other sort of consequences for how your business will sustain moving forward.
It's a great question, and it relates to Jennifer's question as well about how do you ensure well-being? Where does well-being fit into it? Whenever you go through change, especially if you go through what might be described as a major transformation program, whether it be a merger and acquisition or something like that, invariably, what it means is that you're asking people to do two things. You're asking them to do business as usual, and you're asking them to buy into the change program. And that's hard to do because business as usual is pretty stressful and exhausting as it is. But you're asking them to buy into that. And you'll see signs of stress. You'll see signs of bullying. You will see bad behaviour in workplaces. And that's quite common. And so there is a question here about timing and speed, but also how you check in on the welfare of your team, right? And that is, if you're action oriented and all you want to do is get through that things to do list as quickly as you can, because you've got to, I've seen changes and they've said this change has to be done in a couple of months. We're moving towards this as the new business as usual within that. If you don't take time to check on their psychological health, on their well-being, on how they're thinking, on whether they're burning out, then you run enormous risk, not just from an occupational health and safety perspective, but equally you run risk, reputational risk, because they'll take that out. They'll take it out on customers, right? They'll take it out on family. It becomes that they're the sort of things that if it's not managed well, it can lead to a really toxic workplace. Carl, in my early days, when I first, probably about 30 years ago, when I led a change program, and I was running all these workshops, and I was quite keen to get everybody on board with the new direction and the values and so forth. And we called this program Building Our Future Together, right? But the acronym of that was BOFT, BOFT. And I remember going into a coffee, the kitchenette of these things. And I walked into this conversation and one staff member said to the other staff member, "Where are you off to?" And they're going, "I'm going to a bullshit and other effing things workshop," which is how they saw the change program. So they changed the acronym to that. And I walked in right at that moment and I could see what they were doing. But to me, it was insightful because for me, it was exciting. It was great. We were moving in a new direction. For them, it was bullshit and other effing things, right? And I can understand it from their perspective. They weren't ready for it. I was taking away valuable time on what I thought was exciting, but it wasn't exciting to them. And that's what we're dealing with. So the idea of well-being and how you bring people along and whether they're on board is really, really important. Now, sometimes not everybody's going to like the change and you're going to have to go through that, but it's one of those things that you have to manage. That's why this notion of, and Jennifer, going back to your question, this idea of psychological safety is more than a policy document. It's a real thing. How do you make sure that in your process of change that it's psychologically safe? And not many know how to do that well.
Right. And just an extension of that point, Phil, we just had a question around clarity. And I think, we've seen it as well in global events where, and, Phil, we were speaking about it before too, around, not, we talk about misinformation and sort of, relying on information, etc. But I think when you're in an organizational setting and you are presenting this new activity, or there's going to be a transaction or what have you, I think a lot of the times your staff rely and require clarity as to what's going to happen. And I think oftentimes those in leadership positions don't do it justice when they present what's actually about to happen. And I think you raised the point in your presentation around, ambiguity actually creates further uncertainty and can lead to the change not being implemented well. Sort of, and you touched on this in some of the Q&A responses as well. But what sort of tips would you have for leaders and those that do manage projects in relation to an activity that involves change, to demonstrate clearly what's going to happen, how is it going to work, and instill, I guess, some degree of confidence in your staff that, if we go on this journey, there is some certainty. What sort of thoughts do you have around that, Phil?
There needs to be a vision of some sort, right? And some like that vision to be detailed right down to the nth degree. I've seen sort of change programs where everything is mapped out, like the change document is about 100 pages long. It's so detailed. And then it's released and people get an opportunity to comment. And their first reaction is, what's the point? How am I supposed to engage with that? What say have I got in any of that? And they don't go to that section. They go to the end to see if their job is still there. That's what they do. So there's got to be a vision and a direction, and it needs to be clearly articulated. What are the objectives of this change? Where are we going, right? But I think it needs to be a fuzzy vision. I think it needs to be a vision that can be developed and evolved. And I think you need to allow people to work with it. People, I think, buy into it if they feel that they've got a say in it and if they feel that there's time in which to do that. So you can't have nothing, because people will say, I don't know where this is going. It's a bit like now they're saying, I don't know where this war is going. I have no idea where the objectives are, whatever it might be. So I feel you need to be reasonably clear about what your vision is and what your objectives are. And you've got to have a little bit of structure there. But if you're too structured, it's going to backfire. If you truly want to bring your people along, give them the opportunity to find their way through that. And the other thing I would say, Carl, would be, if you've got a vision, then don't say, this is the way we're going to achieve that vision. You're better off saying, there are 3 ways I think we can achieve this vision. This way, or the other way, and then give people choice. So I think that's really important, that if you're a leader, don't be overly controlling, don't be overly detailed, but do allow choice so that people can buy into it and say, I think that one there is going to work best for us.
Very, very important. And Phil, just to end off the Q&A session, sort of some of your observations, I guess, in 2026. What are sort of the top, 1, 2, 3 sort of matters on people's minds? I know it might be skewed by recent events that have happened in the past month, but sort of in your interactions with your clients and the work that you do, Phil, what are some of the top 3, I guess, activities that are sort of demanding change within organizations?
To me, I think it sort of varies. I think if you're the business people I speak to, it's very much about, they're concerned about cost. Cost of living is not just limited to household. There's a lot of businesses that are worried about cost. They're also worried about how best they can market themselves and how to embrace new technologies. So this whole idea of, how do I get growth through marketing? How do I reduce cost? Many of them, as you would expect, are thinking about AI, and they're seeing it potentially as a solution to reducing costs. The evidence around that is really interesting, and particularly coming out of the States, is that in the States, those who've moved to AI and have made a whole bunch of staff redundant are having to rehire 50% of the ones that they let go of. So there's this kind of thing about, it sounds great, but you still need some people there to do the job. So business are trying to navigate that, and they're saying, firstly, how do I grow by looking different, feeling different, how do I grow my brand? How do I grow my services? How do I collaborate? The idea of just being your business on your own is not going to fly anymore. So they're looking for sort of strategic partnerships. And then others are saying, and even though one might say, if you look at the unemployment rate, we have a fairly low unemployment. So there is a risk here that the best people will go because there's opportunities. So there is something about, how do I create an opportunity where people actually want to stay? Because every time they go, that's going to cost me, that's going to cost more. So we're seeing that for the larger businesses, it is about technology, it is investment, and it's about productivity. How do we get more out of our workplace? And the reason for that is growth is really, really difficult. And that's why I kind of feel I'm so passionate about this change stuff, because I sort of feel that we're getting to a fork in the road where a lot of businesses have run out of ideas. They've just run out of ideas, and they're jumping from one thing to the next in desperation. So if you're big, you're thinking very much about, I've got to lower my costs, I've got to increase my revenue, I've got to get more productivity going, right? And am I still relevant? Or do I risk losing my business to new competitors because the cost of entry for new entrants is much lower than what it's been? So it's a particularly difficult time, I think, for business. And at the same time, they too read the news, they watch the news and say, what's happening next? Where are we going tomorrow? You know, a few weeks back, you know, petrol was affordable. Now I can't get it anymore. And so we're seeing these kind of shocks to the system, which means that they're in crisis mode virtually every morning from 9 o'clock. And they're trying to say, what do I now need to do today? So that's the shift I'm seeing. That's what's worrying people. The leaders of the business owners, and Jen's here, we were talking about it. It's stress, it's burnout. I speak to them and say, what's your biggest issue? And they're saying, you know what? My partner doesn't want to hear my problems anymore. I can't take my problems home. I've got so many problems over here. I need someone to talk to, but I can't build that at home because my partner's saying, I'm sick of it, leave it at home. And so for leaders who are confused, the gap that I'm seeing is they're looking for someone to advise them, a bit of a strategic partner to support them in that particular way, because trying to lead in this space is really hard.
No, thank you, Phil. This has been an exceptional seminar. I think very timely on what's happening around the world. So thank you for your time. I'll just share Phil's details again on screen. So if you do have any specific questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to him. For those that have joined late, this session is being recorded. So if you do, want to watch the entire session, you can do so on our YouTube channel later today and moving forward. And also there's a one-page handout which I'll send through to registered participants by email. So you'll have the document handy for your future reference as you wish. So thank you for attending a Be Informed session. Today is actually our 50th session that we've held since November 2022. So I feel you're very special to be joining us today. We've got another session coming up next month around managing money under pressure, which I think is a very timely topic, and I've got a lot of interest in people wanting to know more about budgeting and financial resilience. So hopefully that's of use to those that need to learn about that. If you have enjoyed watching today's session, please do follow us on social media and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and share any thoughts with me, or with, if you liked it, please do refer to family and friends. At least they can learn and make good decisions, which is what we are trying to achieve. So once again, thank you, Phil, for your time today. And hopefully those that have joined in today or tuned in the future will have learned something of benefit. So with all of that, thank you very much, and bye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Carl.
Thanks, Phil.